Thank you all so much for being here with us today. This is Building Resilience Through Routines. And first, though, we want to start out with, in case you haven't seen this before, this slide. We are doing a celebration of stories of growth and survival and innovation. And we want, or we would like for you all to submit any stories that you have about this past year and celebrations you could share. Or even if you have a celebration from one of your teaching colleagues that you think should be put out there for people to know about the great things that have been happening in remote learning, you can tweet it at APS_TLN with the hashtag celebrate teachers. Or you can scan that QR code and fill out the Google form, and we are going to put that out through Twitter and our newsletter. But we wanted to take this spring opportunity to celebrate all of you and your teaching staff and their accomplishments. So, like I said, this is Building Resilience Through Routines, and we're glad that you're here. Mark has dropped the slide deck into the chat, as well as the activities page, correct?
I'll do the activities page a little later.
In a minute, he will also drop the activities page for you. So today's agenda, we're going to go over briefly what resilience is. We're going to talk about some resilience frameworks that you could adopt into your classroom as routines. And then we'll talk about teaching new routines and resilience. And at the end, we'll have some work time and discussion for those of you who can stay. We know that some of you may have classes to teach. So if you do have to step out, we totally understand. And all of this will be available to you later as well. So what is resilience? Essentially, resilience is our ability to adapt well in the face of adversity, trauma, threats, and significant forms of stress. So these could be family and relationship problems, health issues, workplace or financial stressors. Of course, the most prevalent right now is just the whole idea of remote learning and COVID. And that's been a stressor for all of us in some way or another. Darcy. Sorry, my puppy is very awake this morning. And resilience is built through self-awareness, prioritizing wellness, strong and supportive relationships, and then finding and acting upon a sense of purpose. Down in the left-hand corner, there is a link to an article from Psychology Today. And if you do some more research on resilience, you'll find a lot of different ideas that people put out. But we felt that these four kind of encompassed everything. Darcy? So let's start with wellness and sense of purpose. And so wellness, of course, if you've been to any of Anna and Molly's wellness sessions, they talk a lot about, mental and physical wellness and taking care of oneself, which allows us then to focus on what we need to accomplish or overcome. And so with our students, we don't have as much control over, if they're getting enough sleep, which usually they're not. If they're taking breaks when they need to, eating right, and getting enough physical movement. And so while we can't control that, how could we support How could we support that or encourage that in our students' lives? And how are we making sure that we are focusing on our own wellness so that we remain resilient? Sense of purpose, looking at what things do you value? What are your interests or favorite activities? Because this sense of purpose and belonging helps to build resilience because it serves as a reminder of belonging and hope. So it factors in with those strong supportive relationships and having things to look forward to outside of whatever struggle is going on. And so the same thing here, we don't have as much control over, what happens to our students when they're at home, but how can we help them find a sense of purpose, whether it's a new hobby or just focusing on what things they value. So sorry, dog. So then if we look at our resilience and how it connects to social and emotional learning, and if you've been to any of our previous sessions this year, you know that we're really big onto social and emotional learning. So luckily resilience really goes hand in hand with this. And if you're teaching explicitly or incorporating social and emotional learning in any way into your classroom, chances are you're already helping your students become more resilient. So, self-awareness and resilience focuses largely in the areas of recognizing their strengths, having accurate self-perception, and having the self-confidence and efficacy to advocate for themselves and to know, here's what I can do, and this can help me overcome in these ways. Resilience in relationships goes along with those systems of support. Strong relationships and communication skills provide that safety net because it reminds students that they do have people that they can reach out to for help, and they're going to be better able to communicate their needs. Resilience and problem solving. Of course, in order to overcome any challenge, we have to at least have some form of problem solving skills, whether it's just identifying what the problem is or whether it's coming up with steps to overcome it and then reflecting upon, um, maybe they've handled similar situations in the past and how did they do it and what could they change to make it better. And then finally, resilience and self management. Goal setting is a huge part of being resilient. So, setting a goal, working towards it, whether it's to overcome something or to just get out of a place that you don't really care to be in. And that takes self discipline and stress management and a little bit there of self motivation as well. So, um, chances are, if you're working on any of these aspects with your class, whether explicitly or implicitly, you are already helping to build up their resilience. So, we're going to take 2 minutes and we'd like you to just quickly reflect on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being very high, to rate your level of resilience. What habits or routines do you use to overcome challenges and remain resilient in the face of adversity? So, personally, what habits or routines do you feel that your students are lacking that maybe inhibits their resiliency? And how has the pandemic magnified resilience or the lack thereof in your students and in yourself? So, we're going to take 2 minutes to mull over these questions. If you feel comfortable, please feel free to drop one or all of your answers into the chat. Um, if you just want to take the minute to personally reflect and not share with us, that's totally fine as well. But you'll have 2 minutes and then we'll move on.
Take another minute. So I don't know about the rest of you, but I know like bullet number 2 really kind of spoke to me on one level just because of I think of all the new routines I've tried to develop during COVID too. We lost a lot of old routines. So what new ones to just kind of help us manage this situation? And then the third bullet, for me personally, that was something I noticed a lot more in my last few years in the classroom was just uh, how much more quickly students might disengage or want to shut down and not having those coping skills to make it through difficult school situations for themselves. So I know those two spoke to me. Um, so thank you for those who are sharing on their resiliency levels and what they've done to help manage. I've seen a lot of workouts and walks people have been putting in the chat. I know walks at about 3:15 in the afternoon just seem to kind of restore me at the end of the day. So Thank you for sharing. So, as we researched resilience, we found like two frameworks, and you can use one of these, you can use both of them, you can adapt them to however you like. But these frameworks are good ways to kind of frame resilience as you talk to students. And so we have the four S's of resilience, and you can see those there. And those four, I feel, really go well with the SEL components that Michaela was just talking about. And then the three P's of resilience. So we're going to take a little closer look at those. So on the 4S framework, we see the first one there is support. Who can you rely on in difficult times? And so that may change depending on the situation that someone's encountering, but that goes back to that relationship building part of SEL and having like that team of people that you can go to, that you can rely on. Strategies. So what coping skills have you learned that can help you in a particular situation? And in SEL, that's kind of that stress management and problem solving of having some coping skills that you can rely on. And we'll talk a little bit more about those. Sagacity. This is that wisdom that we've developed. And this is one that we may have to work a little bit more with students. They may think they haven't developed wisdom from previous experience. And yes, they haven't been around as long as we have, but we can help guide them to show that they've probably been through more and been resilient in situations more than they might realize. But wisdom doesn't only have to come from our stories or other people's stories. I don't know about you, but like when it comes to music or movies or books, and if you have a personal favorite of those, like there's certain song lyrics or certain movies that you have little wisdom bits that are back that you rely on. The example I used yesterday is I don't know if anyone's familiar with the television show Northern Exposure. It's probably 20 to 30 years old now, but I loved those episodes because I felt like they were so full of these little wisdom pieces. And I found myself quoting from that show quite often. So for me, that particular show gave me some wisdom for certain situations. And then solution seeking. What are some possible next steps? So we have the problem solving component again of not just identifying what the issue, but what are some possible steps we can take? So that's the 4S framework. The three P's of resilience go around personalization, permanence, and pervasiveness. So that personalization is that realizing that the problem may not be about you. Like if I know a situation a lot of people have experienced during COVID has been job loss. And so it's hard not to internalize that and think that you're the issue, but there's all these other outside factors that have been at play contributing to possible job loss. So if we can realize that and be aware of that, that allows us to maybe reduce that blame and criticism that we place on ourselves. Permanence. This is that thinking that that bad situation is going to last forever. And so this is where previous experience can help. We realize that maybe some of these issues are like the weather, they'll eventually pass. And so the more we experience that, the more we realize a current struggle is eventually going to pass. COVID has definitely been a trial of this because, you know, we're on a full year now that we've been experiencing with it. Sometimes it's felt like it's never going to end, but realizing that just like the Spanish flu in 1918, it eventually normal life did restore. And that pervasiveness, this is taking that situation and having it apply in all areas of your life. So back to like that job loss situation, realizing that the job loss doesn't speak to like how you are as a parent or how you are as a friend or your social situations, that that is one component of your life. And yes, it's a big one, but it's not all of who you are. And so it allows us to kind of separate our thinking that it's all about our whole life and realizing it's one aspect. So that's the 3P template. And as we move on, you'll have a chance to work with both of those.
All right. So, when we talk about making resilience routine and we think about these frameworks, we wanted to kind of separate out where we could build in these resiliency routines. And so these are all areas that when you're considering where in your classroom you could start to integrate more discussion about resilience or to help build up student resilience, these came to mind for us. So when we think about, Darcy, explicit instruction, using specific vocabulary from either the frameworks or just using um, what the vocabulary of resilience. This can be done through explicit behavior discussions. So talking about, those problem solving and what strategies that we have when you're establishing. I'm so sorry, Darcy. When you're establishing structure at the beginning of the year, this will also. I'm so sorry, Mark. Could you take over for just 2 seconds?
Sure.
Thank you.
So she hit the main part of this, which was that there are certain routines we can develop explicitly, like how we discuss issues with students, establishing those structures at the beginning of the year and or when hybrid begins. Some of these might be better suited for advisory, because we can't always take 30 minutes to do an explicit lesson within our content. So using advisory, how can we build in goal setting into that? And then we'll show you some lessons. But then there's also those ways of how we can integrate it into our regular content that we'll discuss a little bit more.
Thank you so much, Mark.
You're welcome.
Quieter environment. Okay. So we also like to just give a brief reminder when building routines. You may introduce it once and then, oh, why aren't they, especially when we think about secondary students, like I introduced it to them, I taught them what to do, why aren't they doing it? So we like to put this in as a reminder that you can explicitly teach and model the new routine step by step, but they still require practice to make it habit. And so making sure that anything you do introduce to your students, whether it's explicit or as part of your content and how you get students to consider different things, make sure that it's being practiced often and really reinforced through specific feedback and behavior specific praise, so that students know how they're doing as far as instilling that as a habit.
And so as you think of like if you have small groups coming back starting Monday, or if we end up in a hybrid situation, that resilience and that routine really going together of especially those students back in person. I know it's going to feel like we're in March, so we should be able to just pick up where we left off with our online learning. But those students who come back in person are going to need that little extra of teaching, practicing, and reinforcing. So as we teach, how can we teach resilience then? So we came up with 6 categories. This is by no means comprehensive. There's other ways you can teach resilience, but we thought these fit in well with classrooms. And we're going to go through each one. And as we discuss these topics, think about how could I use a 4S and 3P format into these particular strategies? How can we routinely integrate these strategies? And that's the key is we may do that one-time explicit lesson, but how can we keep bringing that message back into our classrooms routinely? And if nothing else, at the end of today, is there one specific strategy you would like to try for building resilience? So keep those in mind as we go through these. And there's going to be a lot, but after this, we'll give you some time to kind of really work with all of it. So the first way of teaching resilience is kind of through those personal overcoming problems and challenges. And like we mentioned already, we all have had to overcome difficult situations and we've all had our daily struggles, some bigger than others at times. And so what we've provided here is this resilience plan. And this goes into a little bit more detail on those 4 S's. And so working through it once, though, at least gives you an idea of how you could adapt it for more like quicker situations in your classroom as opposed to doing this like 30-minute activity each time. And so here in a little bit, this will be one of the activity choices, but seeing how we've been resilient in our own lives is one way to teach resilience. Another way, and this is kind of one of my favorite ways, is through other people's stories, especially sometimes at the secondary level. Sometimes you have some students who, I mean, they will share everything. And you have other students who really are hesitant to share anything about their personal life. And so we can use other people's stories to at least build in and explicitly talk about resilience. So this option B website that's linked here has a lot of great stories over many, it's all centered around resilience, but it's broken up into a lot of different topics like grief and loss. And then these two short videos, these are something that could be used in a content class because they're only like 2.5 minutes long. So it could be a good reminder or a good check-in activity in the first 5 minutes of the day. Both those stories are really good. The one's about a teen who he hasn't had his arms for a while due to a bacterial infection, but he's been on the high school or on his basketball team at his middle school. And this World War II vet who survived Normandy, but said the hardest thing he's ever done in his life was overcoming his fear of learning to read. And so he learned to read like in his 80s. And so these are good stories of building resilience. And I think as you watch them, you could see how you could integrate that 4S or 3P framework.
Finally tonight, rejection.
It does this every time.
Yeah.
There we
So goal setting. Goal setting is another way, and Michaela mentioned this earlier, that we can teach resilience. We can do it through a very explicit lesson. And so the one I probably see the most as you look up goal setting are the SMART goals. And so we've provided a couple like explicit lessons that you could use on SMART goal setting. But once you have that, students have that basic concept, maybe we could work that in routinely for like right before assignments, setting a goal, especially those bigger projects, or a weekly goal that we could have students do at the beginning of the week. So as you think about this, how could we do it explicitly, but how could we also work it in routinely and goal setting into short periods of time? Coping skills. I mentioned this earlier in terms of it just, to me, seemed like students didn't have as many coping skills. And so they kind of gave up on situations sooner. So a possible activity is students could brainstorm school situations, real life situations of when they become discouraged, when they want to quit. But instead of just stopping there with those situations, we could also have them brainstorm positive and negative ways that students cope. And maybe when situations come up in class, we can resort to that list that they have helped develop of, okay, this is kind of where you're at right now. Can we possibly look at another coping skill that appeals to you to help you get through this situation? Brain breaks, just a little bit of 5 minutes of music sometimes is all that takes a kid to kind of bring themselves back. So how can we build those into our class routines when we see these situations arise? We've provided some resources that kind of guide in this manner of coping cards and some situation cards. They kind of address real world, just everyday life situations, but school situations can apply to this as well. Teacher and student voice. I don't know about you, but I'm sure there's a couple times a year where I'm struggling to get through a particular lesson, or there's just a day with a particular group that's a struggle. And if I have that ability, that's one where as I'm working my way through it, I can be honest with them that, okay, this is a time where this is a struggle for me, but here's how I've managed to cope through that situation. So we can model it through our own behavior, whether it's in our school life or in our personal lives. There might be some stories we can share. Having some time for student discussions. And the reason behind this, and we'll kind of show how it can be integrated in a moment with your content, is that feeling of community, that they're not alone. So it goes back to that personalization that a lot of us have probably experienced the same issues, but hearing other people's stories just kind of takes that pressure off of ourselves. So here's 4 examples of student discussion protocols you could use. Some are more verbal, others can work with more like the online tech tools. So encourage you to check those out. And finally, how do we integrate it into our content and our classes? So one of the upcoming activities, I highly recommend you watch this video that's on here, because even though it's a 5th grade class, you can see both ways of that explicit and kind of building it into content that teachers are building resilience in students. So I highly recommend that. And then in your particular content, can you think, are there particular times where your students tend to shut down? Like if you're a language arts teacher, is it in the middle of the writing process? Is it at the beginning? Like in math, are there particular times where you see students kind of starting to disengage? So how can we help students through those times? So maybe if they struggle with the writing process, we have a student discussion before the writing process to share, this is why I struggle, and go over some of those coping skills. Um, Setting goals beforehand and just giving them that framework before they encounter that difficult time. Or maybe we have to stop in the middle and say, okay, we see we're having troubles. Let's step back and address this a different way. And content, how can you integrate your content lessons and stories that are associated with your content? There's, as a history teacher, so many good examples of resilience. If I could go back and do it again, I would have been much more concrete and using that specific vocabulary of making the students much more aware of it. We looked at a lot of resilience stories, but I didn't verbally discuss the resilience piece specifically with students as much as I could have. Classroom situations. Think of a time where you've worked with a student who was upset and having difficulty managing emotions. Now, how could you reframe that conversation through those frameworks? Okay, what support do you need? What coping skills do we have that we could help you with? That failure and growth mindset of how do we reframe those times where do we make school where it's okay to experience that failure? It's more about the learning and growing and not that always immediate result. I highly recommend that video of the school swimmer who couldn't swim. He specifically chose the swimming team because he couldn't swim, because he wanted to experience failure. And by his senior year, he led his relay team to the state tournament. So that's a really good story of resilience. Can we build in, like through reflection times, like journaling, 5-minute little warm-ups and check-ins? Like just describe one thing that didn't go well the past week and how'd you overcome it? And then we provided a couple lesson plans. Michaela mentioned that sense of purpose at the beginning. So there's one here about using values to build resilience. And then making that vocabulary part of our everyday classroom routines. Those are just some ideas. One last thing. One thing to be cautious with on routines and resilience. We can overdo routines to the point where we become rigid. And so sometimes we need to have that flexibility to keep our brains fresh and just to mix things up a little bit. So keep that in mind. And a couple years ago, resilience was getting some bad press. And the main reason was people felt like resilience was being used too much. So not all struggles are because of a lack of resilience. You can have someone who's a very resilient person, but they still need to have the experience of the emotions and the hardship. It's a process. It's not an immediate, oh, you're struggling, buck up and be resilient kind of message. And resilience is not a reason to accept poor conditions or injustice. And that was where some writers were worried, researchers were worried, as bosses were using resilience as a way to overlook what I'm demanding of you and just be resilient, as opposed to let's actually address the working conditions at this place. So those are some kind of just words of caution with resilience.
Awesome. So that concludes the content portion of our session today. So we wanted to give all of you a chance to look through some of those activities that we've pulled out and compiled, and actually look into how those could be, how you could use those in your classroom, or how you could share those with the teachers at your school site, to help with this work of resilience. Um, so Mark is going to, or has already put into the chat, the link to the activity page, and it's also linked here. And
Yes,
it'll prompt you to make a copy so that you have your own working copy. And so for about the next 15 to 20-ish minutes, you're going to have a chance to work through those activities that we've compiled. So the video of resilience in schools, the 4S plan, the 3P template, and then some personal reflection and resource browsing. So during this time, you can turn your camera off to work, but if you'll stay in the meet, that would be great, unless you have to leave. If you have to leave at this point because you have a class, we wanted to thank you so much for coming, and we hope that these resources are helpful to you. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out at any time and we can work through any of this with you.
and feel free to work on those lessons in any order. They're
Yeah.
more for what you need. So if you want to go back through the slide deck and look at some of those resources, you can. If you want to watch the video, this is kind of your time with some options for the next 15 to 20 minutes.